is what people don't understand and they can't ask or say or relate to. Bro, your whole fucking life, bro, it's been a weight on your shoulders.
Yeah.
There is a moment in every great quarterback's career when the pressure becomes so overwhelming that something inside them either breaks or hardens into something unbreakable. For most rookies entering the NFL, that moment comes during their first season. The stadium lights feel brighter than anything they've experienced before. The media scrutiny feels suffocating in ways training camp never prepared them for. The expectations of an entire fan base sitting on their shoulders feel heavier than anything they imagined possible during their college years. Most young quarterbacks spend their first season simply trying to survive that pressure. Shedeur Sanders has been surviving it since childhood. That is not a marketing statement. That is not hype manufactured by a proud father or a supportive network of people with something to gain. That is the documented reality of a young man who grew up in one of the most visible households in American sports, carried expectations that no child should have to carry, absorbed criticism that would have crushed lesser individuals, and arrived at the NFL draft as one of the most mentally prepared quarterbacks this league has seen in a generation. When Cam Newton sat down with Shedeur Sanders and looked him in the eye and said, "Bro, your whole life, it's been a weight on your shoulders," he wasn't being dramatic. He was being precise. He was identifying something that the mainstream sports media has consistently failed to recognize, something that draft analysts have repeatedly overlooked.
Not really caring. Whatever it is, they're going to go do it. So whenever you see them final minutes in a game and you understand, okay, cool, Tu's in that mode now, then it's just like, Coach, we getting it empty and I'm calling it. That's how I go. Right-handed guy.
While measuring arm strength and evaluating footwork, and something that Cleveland Browns fans are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The weight Shedeur Sanders has carried isn't the kind that breaks a person, it's the kind that builds one. And what has been built inside this young quarterback is something that cannot be coached, cannot be developed through a training program, and cannot be replicated by any other prospect in this draft class regardless of their physical gifts or their statistical production. What has been built is a mindset forged in pressure so consistent, so relentless, and so publicly visible that the NFL spotlight feels familiar rather than foreign. What has been built is a leader who understands—
Hey, listen, bro. Real question. Who knows you the best?
My dad.
Like, how you feel, emotional, excited. Who knows Shedeur Sanders?
I'll say probably Daryl, the quarterback coach who I train with. Probably.
Understands the difference between performing under expectations and being consumed by them. What has been built is a quarterback who walked into the most scrutinized position in professional sports, having already survived a lifetime of scrutiny that most players will never experience. This is the story of how that happened. This is the examination of what Cam Newton's interview revealed about who Shedeur Sanders truly is beneath the surface narrative. And this is the explanation of why the Cleveland Browns may have just secured the most mentally equipped young quarterback in the entire league. When Cam Newton decided to bring Shedeur Sanders onto his platform for a genuine conversation rather than a surface-level promotional appearance, something rare happened in the world of sports media. The mask came off, not because Shedeur was hiding anything, but because the format allowed him to speak with the kind of honesty that traditional press conferences and pre-draft interviews never permit. Cam Newton is uniquely qualified to have this conversation. He knows what it means to be a quarterback who carries something heavier than just the playbook. He knows what it feels like to have every decision magnified, every personality trait debated, every moment of confidence labeled as arrogance by people who would celebrate the same traits in a different body. He understands the psychological warfare that comes with being a quarterback in the modern NFL, especially when you're someone who doesn't fit the traditional mold that the establishment has always preferred. That shared understanding created a space where Shedeur could speak without filtering himself, and what came out of that conversation was a portrait of a young man whose mental architecture is unlike anything the league is currently receiving in this draft class.
Talking crazy or anything like that, but now when you got some guys on the team that can't stick up for themselves, or you got guys on the team that's not in them, you got to become that. Because they gonna follow the leader. They gonna follow the guy that's gonna be out there.
The most important thing Cam said wasn't a compliment. It was an observation that cut straight to the heart of everything people misunderstand about Shedeur Sanders. Bro, your whole life, it's been a weight on your shoulders. Think about what that statement actually means. Cam wasn't talking about the weight of being a top draft prospect. He wasn't talking about the pressure of playing quarterback at a high-profile college program. He was talking about something that started in childhood and never stopped. A weight that followed Shedeur Sanders through every grade school classroom, every youth football game, every adolescent moment that should have been free from the kind of scrutiny that most adults never experience. And what was Shedeur's response to having that truth laid out in front of him? He didn't get emotional, he didn't deflect, he didn't minimize it or pretend it wasn't real. He simply confirmed it with the calm certainty of someone who made peace with that reality a long time ago, and then he explained exactly how that weight shaped him rather than destroyed him. That response alone told you everything you needed to know about his mental foundation. Shedeur Sanders grew up in a 25,000 square foot mansion. That fact gets repeated frequently in conversations about him, often as a setup for criticism, as evidence that he was born into privilege, and therefore his success should be discounted or viewed with skepticism. People who want to diminish his achievements point to that house as proof that everything was handed to him. But those people are missing the entire lesson of that story because the mansion isn't the point. The lesson is what happened next. Deion Sanders, despite having the financial resources to keep his family in that expansive estate indefinitely, made a deliberate decision to move the entire family into a regular home. Still comfortable, still more than adequate, but nowhere near the same level of luxury that the mansion represented. Why would a man of Deion Sanders' wealth and success make that choice? Because he understood something profound about the psychology of achievement that most parents with resources never fully grasp. Comfort without contrast creates entitlement. Luxury without perspective destroys hunger. When everything around you feels normal and effortless, you lose the ability to appreciate what you have, and more importantly, you lose the drive to work for what you want. Deion didn't want his sons to be the kind of young men who assumed success would always be present simply because it had always been present. He wanted them to understand through genuine lived experience what the difference felt like between having everything and having something that required effort and sacrifice to maintain. And here's where the story gets truly interesting. The Sanders brothers didn't just move into a smaller house. They attended charter schools with limited funding. They sat in classrooms without extra resources or elite program advantages. They were surrounded by everyday students navigating everyday struggles, the kind of environment where privilege doesn't protect you and where real character gets tested and revealed. Think about what that experience does to a child who grew up with a basketball court, a football field, and an arcade inside his home. Think about the perspective shift that comes from suddenly existing in a world where those advantages are gone, and the students around you are dealing with genuine challenges that have nothing to do with which car is in the driveway. That shift builds empathy. It builds awareness. It builds the kind of grounded understanding of the real world that wealthy families often spend decades trying to instill in their children and frequently fail to achieve because they're unwilling to actually remove the comfort that prevents the lesson from landing. Deion Sanders was willing, and the result is a quarterback who understands what struggle feels like, not as a concept, not as something he read about, but as something he experienced while still young enough for it to shape his foundational character. When Shedeur Sanders looks at a teammate who is dealing with adversity, who is struggling under the weight of expectations or personal challenges or the difficulty of adjusting to professional life, he isn't relating from a place of comfortable distance. He's relating from a place of genuine shared experience. And that's the kind of connection that makes a quarterback a real leader rather than just a talented thrower. One of the most honest things Cam Newton said during the entire interview was this observation about Shedeur's public identity. Not until the last couple of years did you become Shedeur. You've always been that. Oh, that's Prime's son. That's the weight most people never see. This is an aspect of Shedeur's journey that rarely receives serious attention, but it deserves to be examined carefully because it reveals a psychological challenge that is genuinely unique in the history of NFL prospects. Every quarterback entering the draft carries some form of identity baggage. Some are defined by their school. Some are defined by their statistics. Some are defined by their draft position or the expectations that come with being projected as a top selection. But those identity frameworks, while sometimes limiting, are at least connected to the individual's own actions and choices. Shedeur Sanders didn't just carry external expectations tied to his own performance. He carried an identity that was constructed around someone else's greatness. From the moment he first stepped onto a football field in any visible capacity, the primary narrative surrounding him wasn't about what he could become. It was about who his father already was. Deion Sanders isn't just a famous former athlete. He is one of the most iconic figures in the history of professional football. He played at a level that is still discussed decades after his retirement. His personality, his style, his swagger, his impact on the game, all of it exists as a permanent fixture in the cultural consciousness of American sports. Being introduced to the world not as yourself, but as the extension of that legacy creates a psychological burden that is genuinely difficult to describe unless you've lived it. Every achievement gets filtered through the question of whether it would have happened without the father's influence. Every failure gets amplified by the expectation that the son of someone so gifted should somehow be immune to struggle. Every personality trait gets compared, contrasted, and evaluated against a standard that was built by someone else's life. For most young athletes, this environment would produce one of two outcomes. Either the pressure of comparison breeds insecurity that manifests as overcompensation, with the athlete constantly trying to prove something that can never fully be proven, or the weight of the expectation crushes the natural development of the athlete's own identity, leaving them trapped in the shadow of a legacy that belongs to someone else. Shedeur Sanders did neither of those things. He found a third path that required significantly more psychological strength than either of the obvious alternatives. He acknowledged the legacy, respected what it represented, accepted that it would always be part of how others initially perceived him, and then quietly and consistently went about the work of building something that was entirely his own. He didn't rebel against his father's identity to establish independence. He didn't disappear into it to avoid the difficulty of differentiation. He walked alongside it while developing the authentic version of himself that now stands apart from it. That's not something most adults manage to do successfully. The fact that a young man accomplished it while also developing into a legitimate NFL prospect tells you something important about the depth of his character. Cam Newton recognized this because he lived a version of it himself. Cam understood the experience of carrying an identity that others tried to define for him, of being seen through a specific lens that didn't capture the full picture of who he was. And it was that shared understanding that allowed him to ask the question that most interviewers never think to ask. For you, how do you manage that type of pressure, bro? And Shedeur's answer was the most clarifying thing he said in the entire interview. He doesn't manage it as pressure. He experiences it as routine. Because it has been present every single year of his life, it has become the baseline of his existence rather than an exceptional circumstance that requires special coping strategies. While other rookies are discovering what it feels like to operate under intense public scrutiny for the first time, Shedeur is simply continuing to operate under conditions that have been his normal since childhood. That normalization of pressure is one of the most powerful psychological advantages a competitor can possess. Cam Newton delivered one of the most important observations in the entire interview when he described the impossible situation Shedeur has always occupied. You're in a lose-lose situation 90% of the time. When you say something, you already lost. When you do something you already lost, your mental has to be bulletproof. This is not an exaggeration. This is an accurate description of the environment Shedeur Sanders has navigated throughout his entire visible athletic career. The structure of the lose-lose situation works like this. When Shedeur performs well, the credit gets redirected. The success is attributed to his father's coaching, his father's recruiting ability, his father's connections, his father's training program, or some combination of external factors that remove the achievement from Shedeur's own column and redistribute it to a narrative that serves the critic's existing framework. When Shedeur struggles, the failure gets amplified beyond normal proportion. Because he is the son of Deion Sanders and therefore supposedly possesses every possible advantage, any moment of difficulty becomes evidence that he was always overrated, always carried, always dependent on his father's name rather than his own ability. If he speaks with confidence about his abilities, he's called arrogant. If he stays quiet and focused, people question whether he has the personality to lead a locker room. If he celebrates his successes, people say he's not humble enough. If he downplays them, people say he doesn't understand his own value. If he engages with critics, he's feeding the noise. If he ignores them, he's avoiding accountability. There is no action he can take, no statement he can make, and no performance he can deliver that will satisfy the specific subset of people who have decided their narrative about him before evaluating the evidence. That is the definition of a lose-lose situation, and living inside it since childhood requires a specific kind of mental discipline that cannot be developed through normal means. The only sustainable response to a genuine lose-lose environment is to completely detach the internal measurement of success from external validation. You have to build an inner standard that is independent of what the outside world decides about you, and then you have to consistently operate according to that internal standard regardless of what the noise says. Most people spend years in therapy trying to achieve that kind of psychological independence. Most athletes never fully achieve it because the competitive nature of sports creates an inherent desire for external validation in the form of wins, statistics, and public recognition. Shedeur Sanders has been building that internal standard since childhood because he had no other sustainable option. The external environment was never going to be fair to him. The public conversation was never going to be balanced or objective. The critics were never going to credit him fully or judge him by a consistent standard. So he built something inside himself that didn't need any of that to function properly. That's what bulletproof actually looks like when you examine it up close. It doesn't mean nothing gets through, it means nothing that gets through stops the functioning of what's underneath. The criticism lands, but it doesn't penetrate the foundation. The unfair narratives exist, but they don't alter the internal compass. Cleveland is getting a quarterback whose mental foundation was stress-tested for years before he ever took an NFL snap. And that matters enormously in a league where psychological resilience often separates successful quarterbacks from talented ones who couldn't survive the environment. The mainstream narrative about Shedeur Sanders' college career frequently centers on the question of whether his production translates to the NFL level. Critics point to his time at Jackson State and question whether competing at an HBCU represents meaningful preparation for professional football. They look at his Colorado numbers and debate whether they reflect genuine individual quality or simply the result of playing within a system designed around his strengths. Those conversations, while sometimes valid from a technical standpoint, consistently miss the more important element of what his college career actually demonstrated. At Jackson State, every game Shedeur Sanders played carried a weight that extended far beyond the football itself. He wasn't just a quarterback trying to win games for his team. He was the son of one of the most famous coaches in America, leading a program that had been repositioned as a statement about the value and quality of HBCU football. Every performance was political as much as athletic. Every win was analyzed as evidence about whether Deion Sanders' bold choice to coach at an HBCU was justified. Every loss was treated as confirmation by critics who had already decided the experiment would fail. Playing under those conditions while simultaneously developing as a quarterback required a compartmentalization ability that goes far beyond what most players develop in any college program regardless of its level. Then came Colorado, and the pressure didn't scale up gradually. It exploded overnight into something that had no real precedent in modern college football. The Colorado program under Deion Sanders became the most watched story in college football almost immediately upon his arrival. Every game was a national event. Every player was scrutinized individually. Every aspect of the coaching staff's decisions was debated by analysts who were watching with a level of attention that Power 5 programs with decades of prestige rarely receive. And Shedeur Sanders was at the center of all of it, playing behind an offensive line that was not consistently capable of protecting him, absorbing physical punishment that piled up over the course of the season while the cameras captured every hit and every struggle. He never folded. He never publicly blamed his protection issues. He never created drama in the locker room about the team's struggles. He never allowed the weight of the attention to disrupt his preparation or his performance in ways that manifested as visible panic or lost composure. He kept working, kept leading, kept taking the hits and getting back up, and kept throwing the football with the kind of confidence that doesn't disappear when the circumstance gets difficult. Critics watched that Colorado season and saw a quarterback who sometimes struggled behind a porous offensive line. What they should have seen was a quarterback who demonstrated the ability to maintain functional poise and consistent effort under conditions that would have revealed the psychological weaknesses of lesser players within the first month of the season. The NFL game will bring new challenges. The defensive schemes will be more complex. The athletes will be faster and stronger. The mistakes will be more costly and more visible than anything he faced in college. But the experience of performing week after week under a national spotlight with legitimate physical risk and enormous institutional pressure stacking up around him, he already has that. While other rookies are experiencing that environment for the first time, Shedeur is walking into familiar territory. One of the elements that emerged from the Cam Newton interview that doesn't receive enough analytical attention is Shedeur's discussion of his commitment to authenticity regardless of circumstance. In professional sports locker rooms, experienced players develop an almost immediate ability to identify false confidence. Veterans who have spent years around athletes know the difference between genuine self-assurance and performed bravado. They can sense when a rookie is pretending to be comfortable in situations where they're actually struggling. They know when someone is saying the right things without believing them. That ability to detect inauthenticity creates an interesting dynamic for incoming quarterbacks. The position requires leadership by design, and leadership requires the projection of confidence and certainty. But if that projection isn't backed by genuine conviction, the experienced players in the room will identify the gap, and the respect that the leadership position needs will fail to materialize. Shedeur Sanders has a specific advantage in this area that comes directly from his background. He grew up around professional athletes. He watched how they carried themselves in environments where performance and professionalism intersected. He absorbed through years of proximity the understanding of what genuine competitive confidence looks and feels like compared to its imitation. He knows how to be real in that environment because he's been around it long enough to understand what real actually looks like. When he said during the interview that he promised himself to always stay authentic regardless of how much success accumulates, that wasn't a rehearsed line designed to generate positive reactions. It was a description of the operating principle that has guided his behavior throughout his entire career. And the practical result of that authenticity is that he doesn't have to work at earning respect from teammates by performing a version of himself that doesn't genuinely exist. He simply operates as himself, and the respect comes from the consistency and transparency of that operation. This is why reports from the Browns facility indicated that players gravitated toward him quickly upon his arrival. It wasn't manufactured chemistry. It was the natural result of encountering someone who is genuinely present and genuinely themselves in an environment where a lot of people are performing versions of themselves that they think the situation requires. Championship quarterbacks create trust in locker rooms before they create wins on scoreboards. They establish a foundation of genuine credibility with their teammates that allows the group to follow their leadership into difficult moments without the collective resolve dissolving under pressure. Shedeur Sanders is building that foundation through the most reliable means available, which is simply being consistently and transparently himself while operating at the highest standard he's capable of producing. For anyone familiar with the broader media landscape surrounding the Sanders family, the Charleston White situation represented a specific test of Shedeur's composure under a different kind of pressure than what football typically produces. Charleston White appeared on Cam Newton's platform and made explosive comments about Deion Sanders. The kind of public statements that could easily trigger an emotional response from anyone connected to the person being discussed, especially a young man with natural protective instincts toward his father. The temptation in that moment for a 23-year-old athlete would be to respond in kind, to defend his father publicly, to push back against the narrative with the kind of heated emotion that the situation could easily justify, to let the personal nature of the attack override the professional discipline that his public position requires. Shedeur did none of that. He assessed the situation with a clarity that most adults twice his age struggle to access in heated moments. He acknowledged that Charleston White operates with a specific persona that sometimes expresses genuine perspective through an exaggerated character framework. He recognized the difference between something said as part of a public performance and something that deserves a serious personal response. And then he moved forward without allowing any of it to create distraction or disruption in his preparation for the most important transition of his athletic life. That level of emotional regulation in a moment with genuine personal stakes is not a small thing. Most criticism Shedeur receives is abstract, directed at his quarterback ability or his draft prospects or his public persona. The Charleston White situation was different because it was directed at someone Shedeur loves and respects more than anyone outside of his closest inner circle. The ability to respond with composure to personal criticism directed at the people you care most about is a genuinely advanced emotional skill. It requires the kind of controlled perspective that comes from years of practice deciding which battles deserve your energy and which ones are better left undisturbed. Shedeur has been making that kind of decision since he was old enough to have a public profile, the practice shows. Cleveland is inheriting a quarterback who will face personal criticism, professional criticism, scrutiny about his family, questions about his legitimacy, and pressure from every conceivable direction simultaneously. The fact that he has already demonstrated the ability to navigate all of those categories without losing his equilibrium is more valuable than any measurable physical attribute on his pre-draft evaluation. The Cleveland Browns are entering a new chapter carrying some of the heaviest organizational baggage in the NFL. The Deshaun Watson contract situation created financial constraints that will influence roster decisions for years. The fan base has endured decades of heartbreak that have created a collective hunger for real, sustained success that feels almost desperate in its intensity. The coaching staff is in the process of proving itself while simultaneously trying to establish a winning culture from the ground up. For a standard rookie quarterback entering this environment, the situation would present genuine psychological danger. The Watson contract story follows every roster conversation. The media is professionally prepared to manufacture and amplify quarterback controversies regardless of whether the on-field situation actually warrants them. Every decision the young quarterback makes will be evaluated through the lens of a fan base that has been conditioned by disappointment to expect the worst even when things appear to be heading in the right direction. The standard rookie quarterback response to this environment would be to quietly survive the first season, manage mistakes carefully, and gradually build confidence as the experience accumulates and the comfort level with NFL complexity increases. That timeline assumes the quarterback needs the environment to become less challenging before they can genuinely thrive within it. It assumes some significant level of adjustment and adaptation before the mental machinery operates at full capacity. Shedeur Sanders doesn't operate on that timeline. He doesn't need the environment to calm down before he can function effectively within it. He has spent his entire life functioning effectively within heightened environments that were consistently louder, more personal, and more unfairly weighted against him than anything Cleveland's media landscape is going to produce. The reporters asking aggressive questions are nothing new. The fan frustration expressed through social media criticism is nothing new. The narratives that frame his every move as either validation of predetermined conclusions or evidence for alternative predetermined conclusions, he's lived inside that framework for years. What this means practically for Cleveland is that the organizational rebuilding process doesn't need to wait for the quarterback to develop the psychological tools required to lead under pressure. Those tools are already fully operational. The focus can go immediately toward the technical and strategic development that will translate his mental readiness into on-field production. When the Browns faced adversity at the end of last season, and Shedeur led the team to back-to-back wins in the final games despite the surrounding organizational chaos, it wasn't a surprise to anyone who understood his background. It was simply the expected output of a quarterback who functions better under pressure than he does in calm circumstances because pressure has always been his native environment. The relationship between Shedeur Sanders and Deion Sanders is perhaps the most consistently misrepresented element of the entire Shedeur Sanders story. Critics frame it as a dependency that inflates Shedeur's value and makes his achievements suspect. They suggest that without his father's involvement, guidance, platform, and reputation, Shedeur would be a significantly lesser prospect. They use the father-son dynamic as a tool for diminishment rather than as context for understanding what actually shaped the person they're evaluating. What Cam Newton's interview made clear, and what anyone paying serious attention to the actual relationship can observe, is that the dynamic between Deion and Shedeur is built on something that has nothing to do with manufactured advantage. Deion Sanders is genuinely the person who knows Shedeur best. When asked who truly understands him, Shedeur mentioned his father first. Not as a reflex or a performance of appropriate familial loyalty, but as a genuine acknowledgement that the person who has watched him navigate every significant challenge, who understands how his mind works under pressure, who has seen him at his most vulnerable and his most confident, is the same person who built the foundation of values that shaped his entire approach to competition and leadership. That relationship is not a liability, it is an asset of extraordinary value. The guidance Deion provided wasn't about creating shortcuts or manufacturing opportunities that Shedeur didn't earn. It was about instilling the discipline, the humility, the competitive standard, and the emotional resilience that a life in elite athletics demands. It was about preparing his son for a world that was going to scrutinize him more harshly and credit him less generously than it would someone without his last name, and giving him the internal resources to navigate that reality without losing his focus or his character. Deion even paid a personal price for his deep involvement in his son's development. The interview referenced how Deion was excluded from certain award events due to his role in Shedeur's career. For most people, that kind of social and professional consequence for supporting your child would create resentment or at least generate some internal conflict about priorities. Deion accepted it without apparent reservation, and Shedeur carries that awareness with him as evidence of what genuine parental investment actually looks like when it's motivated by love rather than ego. That knowledge that his father sacrificed genuine professional comfort to support his development is part of what grounds Shedeur in the understanding that his success represents something that extends beyond personal achievement. He's honoring an investment. He's completing a mission that began long before he was old enough to understand what it meant. That sense of purpose beyond personal ambition is one of the most powerful motivational forces available to any competitor. It means the work never feels purely transactional because the stakes are always personal in the deepest possible way. When we eventually look back at the beginning of Shedeur Sanders' professional career with the perspective that time provides, a few things will likely be clear that aren't universally recognized in the present moment. First, the draft process itself and the specific way Shedeur's selection unfolded will be recognized as one of the more unusual stories in recent draft history. The circumstances that led to him being available in the 5th round despite being widely projected as a top quarterback prospect created a specific narrative that he will carry into his early NFL career. Whether that narrative becomes one of vindication or remains a complicated part of his story depends largely on what happens on the field. But here's what history tends to do with quarterbacks who possess the kind of mental foundation that Shedeur has already demonstrated. It validates them. Eventually, sometimes after significant struggle, sometimes after the media narratives have already moved on to the next story. But eventually, the psychological architecture that allows a player to maintain consistency and growth under pressure reveals itself in the only measurement that ultimately matters, which is sustained performance over time. Second, the conversation Cam Newton initiated about the weight Shedeur has carried and what it actually produced will be referenced repeatedly as the NFL story of his career develops. Because Cam saw something that the draft analysts and the football experts with their metrics and measurements didn't fully capture. He saw a person who has already been through the fire and came out harder, not softer, more focused, not more fragile, more certain of himself, not more desperate for external validation. That profile doesn't guarantee a championship. It doesn't protect against bad offensive lines or poor scheme fits or the ordinary variance that affects every player's career trajectory. Football is too complex and too unpredictable for any psychological profile to function as a guarantee of outcomes. What it does guarantee is that the effort will always be genuine. The preparation will always be serious. The leadership will always be authentic. And when the moments arrive that define a quarterback's legacy, the mental equipment will be ready to respond with everything that years of training and lived experience can produce. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the story of Shedeur Sanders will eventually help reshape how professional football evaluates the psychological component of quarterback development. Because the current system underweights mental readiness relative to physical measurables in ways that consistently produce surprising results when players who look perfect on paper struggle under pressure and players who carry complicated backgrounds succeed in environments that seemed likely to overwhelm them. Shedeur is going to be a data point in that ongoing conversation for a long time. What Cam Newton's interview ultimately revealed wasn't a secret. It was a truth that was always visible to anyone willing to look past the noise and examine what actually shaped Shedeur Sanders into the person who showed up at the Cleveland Browns facility ready to compete for the future of that franchise. The weight was real, the pressure was real. The unfairness of being judged through a lens he didn't choose was real. The sacrifice required to build something genuine inside an environment that would have made a lesser person either collapse or compromise their character was real. And the result of all of it standing across from Cam Newton, speaking with the quiet certainty of someone who has already settled every important internal question about who they are and what they're built for, was also real. Shedeur Sanders is not entering the NFL looking for the opportunity to prove himself. He is entering the NFL having already proven himself in a different kind of arena, one where the stakes were personal rather than professional, and where failure would have meant something far more significant than a bad statistical line in a game that didn't matter. He passed that test. He passed every version of it that his particular life presented, And now the football test begins in earnest. Cleveland didn't just draft a quarterback. They drafted the answer to a question they've been asking for decades. Whether the answer is everything they're hoping for will depend on development, opportunity, health, and the countless variables that make professional football impossible to predict with certainty. But one thing is certain. Whatever challenges come, whatever the external environment produces, whatever narratives the critics construct, Shedeur Sanders has already survived worse. He already carried heavier. He already stood in the fire when the fire was personal and the support was limited and the crowd was loudly rooting for his failure. He came through that with his character intact, his confidence genuine, and his foundation solid. That's not nothing. In fact, in the landscape of modern professional football where mental toughness is the rarest and most valuable resource a quarterback can possess, that might be everything. The wait prepared him for this moment, and the moment is finally here. Does the mainstream media truly underestimate Shedeur Sanders' mental toughness, or is the narrative finally beginning to shift toward acknowledging what has always been there? Subscribe to stay connected to every step of this journey as it unfolds in Cleveland, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.